Hi, my name is Jack Rackham, and today we're back on the Northern and Eastern European family trees chart. We've already taken a look at the royal families of Denmark and Sweden on this channel, so today we're looking at the kings and queens of Norway, starting all the way from the 9th century down to today. We begin with the legendary first king of Norway, Harald Fairhair. If you've seen the recent video about which figures from the Bible are historical, you'll remember that legendary means he was probably a real person who really did rule in Norway. But much of the things we read about him have probably been greatly exaggerated over the years, since most of our records come from the Icelandic sagas, written hundreds of years later, hundreds of miles away. Think of it like how, if you're watching the show Vikings, there's a lot you can learn about all the different characters, but you can't take everything that happens in the show at face value. According to the Icelandic sagas, Harald was rejected by a princess who told him she would only marry him if he became king over all Norway. Harald then took a vow not only to become king of Norway, but not to cut or comb his hair until then, giving him the name Tanglehair. But 10 years later, after the Battle of Hafrsfjord, he united Norway into a single kingdom, married the princess, and now that he could comb his hair again, he took on the name Fairhair. In reality, while there are many details we don't know for certain, it's likely Harald was a king of one of the many petty kingdoms in Norway at the time. Sort of like how Alfred the Great is an English folk hero and the ancestor of the first kings of England, but he was only the king of a much smaller kingdom called Wessex. The Battle of Hafrsfjord was a real event that led to Harald expanding his influence over other kingdoms in the region, but the unification of Norway didn't happen overnight. Unification also wasn't a one-way street. After Harald's death, his kingdom was splintered between several of his sons and his earls. But about a lifetime later, there was a king named Olaf II. You can see with these dotted lines here that he claimed descent from Harald Fairhair, but that claim is a bit, well, spotty. There are a few sagas describing him adventuring around the Baltic as a young man, but the important thing is that Olaf II is the one who united Norway for good, by gaining the support of multiple petty kings, and by defeating the Earl Svein Håkonsson in the north. He aimed to extend his power further by allying himself with Sweden and invading Denmark while Knut the Great was preoccupied in England, but his army was crushed. A bunch of unhappy nobles then supported a counter-invasion by Knut, who took over Norway in 1028. Olaf II made one last attempt to reclaim the kingdom in 1030, but was killed in the war. Olaf II was then canonized as a saint by one of his advisors who held an important position in the church, and he has since been credited for the Christianization of Norway. Though he had converted to Christianity, he actually didn't do that much proselytizing in his life, but after his death, he became the patron saint of the kingdom, as well as a popular saint in both the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, and future kings worked to make him even more popular so they could point to their saintly ancestry. After Knut's death in 1035, Norwegian lords, with the help of Sweden, placed Olaf's son Magnus I on the throne when he was just 11. When he was 16, he declared war with Denmark with plans to reunite the two kingdoms, but the war was costlier than expected. In the end, he met with the Danish king, another one of Knut's sons, called Harthacnut, or Knut III, and they decided whoever died first would be succeeded by the other. Only 2 years later, Harthacnut died suddenly at a wedding, the leading theory being that he died of a stroke brought on by excessive drinking. Magnus then attempted to completely recreate Knut's North Sea Empire by taking over England, but he never got the chance. His uncle Harald, who had been exiled in 1030 after fighting on behalf of Saint Olaf, had returned to Norway and threatened to work together with Knut's nephew in Denmark if Magnus didn't agree to share the Norwegian crown. Magnus then died suddenly in 1047 at the age of 23. So Denmark passed into the hands of Svein II, and Norway into the hands of Harald Hardrada. That name might sound familiar, and we'll look at why in just a second. Like I mentioned earlier, Harald had been exiled from Norway, in which time he served in the army of the Kievan Rus under Yaroslav the Wise, and then in the Varangian Guard under Michael IV of the Eastern Roman Empire. When he became king, he took his own shot at recreating the North Sea Empire, but after almost 20 years of claiming Denmark, he never was able to take control. So, he invaded England instead, landing up in the north. The year was 1066. He fought the English at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in September and lost, just 3 days before William the Conqueror landed in the south of England. Hardrada's invasion is often seen as an important factor in William's victory at the Battle of Hastings, and it just goes to show that timing is everything. Hardrada was killed at Stamford Bridge, marking the unofficial end of the Viking Age. But his son Olaf was able to return to Norway, where he quickly became king and swore off his father's aggressive foreign policy, entering into an extended period of peace. He negotiated with England and Denmark and faced invasion from neither, and also managed to put an end to his father's feud with certain members of the church. After Olaf III, his son Magnus III picked up a more aggressive outlook, this time projecting power across the Irish Sea. And then we have Sigurd I, known as Sigurd the Crusader. Sigurd was king along with his half-brothers Olaf and Øystein, and led Norway through a golden age. Since he was so well-traveled and versed in combat as a result of accompanying his father throughout the British Isles, he became the first European king to personally lead a crusade in 1107. He brought his army all the way down to the eastern Mediterranean to support the new Christian kingdom of Jerusalem, where he conquered Sidon, then traveled around meeting the Doge of Venice and the famous Byzantine emperor Alexios I while he was on his way back home. But that golden age came to an abrupt end when Sigurd died in 1130, as the country was plunged into civil war for over 100 years. You see, Norway at the time did not have a clear law of succession. By default, all the king's sons, regardless of age, whether legitimate or not, were considered to have an equal claim. Hence, Olaf III was originally a co-ruler with his half-brother, and Sigurd I was a co-ruler with his half-brothers. And surprisingly, this had worked out thus far. But all these gaps in the line represent illegitimate children, and those are just the ones who successfully claimed power at one point or another. So by the 12th century, there were a lot of possible kings, all competing for power, and eventually coalescing into two factions. Imagine England's Wars of the Roses, but nearly 4 times as long. Unsurprisingly, we won't be trying to untangle all of that today, but we'll touch briefly on the highlights. Just when the war seemed to be winding down with one party in power, a young man named Sverre came in from the Faroe Islands, claiming to be the son of a former king. Miraculously, he managed to drill the opposing party's ragtag soldiers into a fierce and professional army and created a huge navy, including the largest ship on the water at the time. And after a long campaign, he managed to take over the kingdom. But while he was a powerful general, he struggled to rule as king. He faced continued opposition from within Norway and got entangled in a power struggle with the church, resulting in his excommunication. Though he had support from England and Sweden, that didn't stop an army led by Norwegian nobles from rising up against him. Sverre was able to put down the rebellion, but died very shortly after, and the period of civil war continued until more than halfway through the rule of Håkon IV. Which is saying something since he ruled for 46 years. But because Håkon spent so long emerging from civil war, he ended up with a powerful army and expanded Norway to its greatest territorial extent yet by taking over Greenland and Iceland. He also managed to make friends with most major European powers, even on both sides of conflict. He Christianized peoples pushed west by the Mongols, the Pope wanted to make him the Holy Roman Emperor, the French king wanted him to lead the French Crusader fleet, and he opened up Bergen to the Hanseatic League. The only exception to this exceptional friendliness was towards Scotland and the British Isles, where he continued to push his power. His son, Magnus the Lawmender, like his name suggests, worked to make sure the new golden age started by his father wouldn't end like the last one. He wrote new codes for the entire kingdom, including a law on succession, making it very clear which of his sons would succeed him as king, and which would be given the title of a duke. He also introduced the idea that crime wasn't just an offense against individuals, but against the state and society as a whole, which is reflected in justice systems today with the distinction between civil and criminal courts. Very quickly, we have his sons. First, Eric II, who took up the old Norwegian tradition of trying to take over Denmark, along with Scotland, and who also fell out with the church, earning him the name priest-hater. After him came his younger brother Håkon V, who continued to strengthen the position of king, and whose reign saw Oslo begin to eclipse Bergen as the center of power in Norway. And then Norway runs into the opposite problem it had all those years ago in the Civil War. This time, there aren't any sons to take the throne. But with clear rules in place, Håkon's grandson takes the throne. Incidentally, he was also the king of Sweden, but he was never very popular in Norway, so it was agreed that his son would rule independently in Norway when he came of age. But then things get complicated again. Håkon VI marries a princess of Denmark named Margaret, so when Håkon died, their son Olaf ruled over Denmark and Norway. But then he died, and Margaret became queen of both kingdoms. And then there was a rebellion in Sweden, and the rebellious lords told Margaret that if she helped them depose King Albert, she could rule Sweden as well, at least temporarily until she provided them with a suitable king. She obliged, and Albert was successfully deposed, and thus Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were all joined together in what's called the Kalmar Union. The next several hundred years have all been covered in the Denmark video, so I encourage you to watch that one if you haven't already, as we won't be repeating everything here. There was a quick exception with Charles VIII, who broke Sweden and Norway apart from Denmark, but they were both brought back into the fold by Christian I of Denmark. This kept the Kalmar Union together until Sweden broke away for good in 1523 with King Gustav I. Norway, however, continued to exist in a personal union with Denmark for 3 more centuries until the end of the Napoleonic Wars. In those wars, Denmark-Norway had joined the Second League of Armed Neutrality, but Britain took this as an offense and attacked, which forced Denmark-Norway into an alliance with France, meaning they ultimately lost the war. As part of the terms of peace, the Danish king had to renounce all claims to Norway in favor of the Swedish monarchy. Norway briefly declared independence with the Crown Prince Christian VIII as king, but Sweden invaded and put an end to that. Norway still had its own legal system and currency, but it was controlled by the Swedish monarch who dictated all foreign policy. But over time, it became clear that Norway had very different interests than Sweden when it came to foreign policy, wanting more international trade and different allies. The people of Norway wanted overwhelmingly to be independent, and in 1905, discussions with the Swedish monarch Oscar II resulted in Norway going out on its own for the first time in over 500 years. Then came the matter of who its new king would be. At first, there were talks that perhaps Norway wouldn't have a king at all and become a republic. But having a monarch was seen as a way for the government to be legitimate and non-radical in the eyes of the rest of Europe, and to ensure a peaceful transition. There was an initial offer to make Oscar II's son, Prince Karl, the new king, but this was not only contentious in Parliament, Oscar himself declined the offer. Ultimately, they settled on the Danish Prince Karl. His mother had connections to the Swedish royal family, and his father had connections all the way back to the medieval Norwegian kings. He accepted the offer and assumed the throne as King Håkon VII. Håkon VII was really a modern ceremonial monarch. Technically, he was given executive authority, but he allowed the Norwegian government to exercise that authority on his behalf. He reigned through both world wars, including the German occupation of Norway in World War II. Hitler gave him an ultimatum to accept a new government or face harsh reprisals. Håkon refused and led the government from exile in Britain. His son Olaf V was also incredibly popular with the people of Norway for his very down-to-earth attitude. He frequently went out in public without bodyguards and made a point to lead by example during the 1973 energy crisis by taking public transportation despite the privileges afforded to him as a monarch. He married his first cousin, just like his father had done, and they had 3 children, including one son, Harald V, the current king of Norway. Harald V, conversely, married a commoner, but the most interesting thing about him is that he's actually a world-class sailor. He competed at 3 Olympic Games and continued to compete at an international level well into his 70s. Perhaps it's an interest he shares in common with Harald Fairhair. He has 2 children, Crown Prince Håkon and the self-proclaimed clairvoyant Princess Martha, as well as 5 grandchildren. Okay, that was a look at the Norwegian royal family tree, a line traceable all the way to the 800s. If you're interested in some of the other royal families we talked about in this episode, including those 500 years of Danish rule, you can find other videos on this channel that cover them in detail. And if you want to pick up a copy of this chart for yourself or for your classroom, you can purchase a poster from usefulcharts.com. Thanks for watching.